that arrangement with Sonata Beer Labs, it's been a bit of a challenge to make sure that these things are regularly available. So that's been awesome. They've been killing it. They've been selling a lot of yeast, and that seems to be working pretty well. So
Hell yeah.
yeah, that's awesome. So thanks for the intro. In terms of how you want to run it, I'm pretty flexible. I did read through the questions that you sent over, and they're really, really good questions. So I really appreciate everyone taking the time to ask those questions, and I'm happy to answer those things. That being said, people want to just straight up ask questions here or throw things in the chat. We can take a bit of a multi-directional approach if you want.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. I mean, yeah, let me, I don't know if you got the document handy. I probably should have pulled that up like a good moderator here. But yeah, I mean, it's really whatever you want to do.
Sure. I can do just a quick intro. If you haven't
Yeah, maybe
heard of
kind of just
Escarpment,
maybe tell us about, kind of, I know you got a background in homebrewing, right? I mean, I've been following the master sourdough baking that is occurring here. Maybe that's a talk for another day, but definitely some interesting stuff. But kind of your career path. Were you a homebrewer before you were a microbiologist? Like, kind of what was your path to kind of get to the place where you are today?
Yeah, I think that's how it starts for everyone. I got into homebrewing in university as a thing to do, I guess, for fun, and also was going to school for microbiology. So the two things really came together quite well. Continued homebrewing, continued doing microbiology, and here we are, eventually starting a yeast company and just trying to do as much as we can to share what we learn about yeast and give people really exciting yeast strains and the knowledge to use them. So that's really where I came from, was that background of home brewing and really falling in love with home brewing, and then eventually getting to work with commercial brewers as well has been super rewarding, and just kind of being immersed in beer, sometimes literally, but usually
There are worse
metaphorically.
things.
Yeah.
Cool,
Yeah, and
man.
so that's what we've done for a while. We've mostly worked with Canadian breweries because we're here in Canada near Toronto. But branching out a little bit more now. There's lots of folks in the U.S. and we know a lot. I know a lot of people in the U.S. through things like, I don't know if anyone here is on Milk the Funk and those kinds of communities. So it's been fun to reconnect with people. This past year, especially with everyone kind of being forced to do this thing online.
Yeah, it's a weird dynamic, but it kind of works. But
Yeah,
definitely leaves a lot to be missed. Yeah, I'm still holding out and hoping that Carnival happens this year. Definitely itching to get back.
It's a very special thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. So what do you say? You want to kind of kick some things off, maybe handle some of these things?
Let's do it.
Cool. So first, and I'm just gonna go right down the line of some of the questions that you guys had submitted previously. But from Fred, so Fred Matry is a member in the Garden State Homebrewers. He's also a commercial brewer as well for a new brewery that opened not too long ago in Jersey. So he was discussing more so with respect to the article you wrote for the impact of pitch rate on Kvike ferments. If you could discuss the flavor impact of some of the compounds specifically you discussed, and was there an update to how some of these compounds either changed or what you found across the variety of temperatures that were experienced?
Yeah, that was a fun one. That one was controversial. Like after we after we released that, we had a guy make a YouTube video basically being very unhappy about the results that we presented. So that was pretty fun. I think that was the most controversial we've gotten thus far. Other than, maybe other yeast labs stealing our ideas, but it is what it is. Yeah, that was fun. So we did a little study on the difference of the impact of different pitch rates on Kvike, and obviously Kvike is a pretty trendy, popular thing for brewers now, and that was definitely worth doing because there's this, I guess, this common wisdom from that world that you have to underpitch, right? You have to pitch like the little flake of yeast into your 5-gallon batch, and that's the traditional way to pitch yeast. Although, it's not really even the traditional way to pitch yeast. It's the traditional way to pitch yeast in one pocket of Norway, not in all of Norwegian farmhouse brewing. So we wanted to test that. Like, is this true? Does it actually taste better or different if you pitch low, like a really small amount of yeast, like 1/10 of what you would normally pitch into your beer. So we did an experiment where we tested 3 different pitch rates and measured what came out. And the answer was, I think, a little bit inconclusive in the sense that for 2 of the strains, there actually was a difference. Like some flavor compounds were increased a little bit at the lower pitch rate. But then for 2 of the strains, we tested 4 total. So for 2 of the strains, there really wasn't much difference. So for half of the strains we tested, it made a difference. For half of the strains, it really didn't. For the strains where it made a difference, what we did see was, and I think that this makes sense just based on other brewing wisdom. With the lower pitch rate, the esters were a little bit stronger. Some of the terpenes, like just some of those aromatic, fruity, citrusy kind of aromas, were a little bit more pronounced. But that was for 2 of the 4 strains. In terms of updating to that, I will say there's another study that should be coming out soon. We've got a really good research partnership with the University of Guelph here in Guelph, and they've got this professor there has grad students that are literally just focused on kvike research at this point, which is a pretty amazing thing to see. And one of the students did a really great project. He fermented with 7 or 8 different kvikes at 7 or 8 different temperatures. It's really thorough test of what can kvike do at different temperatures. So I think they did everything from 12°C, so like mid 50s Fahrenheit, up to 43°C, so 105 or something Fahrenheit. So they did a huge range, and so I'm hoping we're able to share that more of that data soon. So we have a lot of information on how a bunch of different kvikes respond to different temperatures. What I will say based on that study is that in general, when we look at temperatures, they're the most fruitiest in a lot of cases at the temperature that the original Norwegian farmers are pitching at, right? If the farmer says pitch it at 37, the lab says, yep, it's fruitiest, it's most flavorful at 37. If the brewer says I pitch at 30, 90 Fahrenheit, sure enough, the lab says the same thing. So it's been really fascinating to us how closely the lab data has matched with what the traditional brewers have been telling us.
That's awesome. I mean, they did have a bit of a head start to refine some of those things. That's pretty cool. So kind of as a follow-up to that from the chat, Jason asked, do you think that the nutrient requirements or fan content had an impact on any of that study or those components with kvike yeast?
Yeah, I mean, it's something you have to control. Like from malt to malt, even year to year of the same malt, you can get different fan content. So it's something you always have to control. Luckily, in that study, the wort that was used had a pretty good fan concentration, so it wasn't like the yeast were struggling in any of those ferments. They had enough of the free amino nitrogen to grow and get through the ferments. I would expect that if you had a wort that had insufficient fan, that you might see different results, right? Because a yeast that's pitched at a lower pitch rate is typically going to require more fan because you have to do a few more generations of growth, right? So that might be a case where, for example, if we had used Pilsner malt that has a little bit lower fan, then we might have seen maybe some different results. Maybe the underpitched ones would struggle a little bit more.
Have you seen any either any common denominators or certain standouts across all the various kvike strains out there as to which ones maybe have a different response to fan levels or fan requirements?
They're all pretty needy.
Yeah.
They're not the most, but they're up there. I would say that in general, they're actually pretty similar, more similar than different in terms of fan requirements.
Very cool. I just watched your video that you did on the Crowdcast and really had never put too much thought into kind of fan content. And as I watched that, one of the things that I know myself and some of the other guys in the club have been talking about for the last couple months is that I've primarily made the switch to a lot of floor malted Pilsner as my base malt, specifically because of the extra character and just the general increase in the better experience.
Hmm.
And that's kind of when it clicked. I was like, oh shit, like there is a correlation here to some degree. So definitely interested to start kind of taking that more deep dive to see, what else we can kind of extract out of some of the yeast character from that respect.
Yep. And that's something I think you see us talk about, and maybe not, maybe we don't always get the point across as clear as we would like, but something we talk about a lot is how interconnected all of the different pieces of the beer are. Like the malt has an influence on how the yeast performs, the hops have an influence on how the yeast performs, and vice versa. All of these things are connected, and that's where we see a lot of mystery, but also a lot of potential.
For sure. Cool. Good stuff. So kind of a follow-up to first question surrounding Kvike, specifically for some of the more lager-like strains. So I know I'm going to be getting my hands on Crispy. I've been an Oslo convert and pretty much preaching to the club like, yo, you guys got to try this. It's pretty wild. So I'm definitely super excited to get my hands on that. What compounds kind of from those types of ferments do you think might kind of either lend to or cause more of the softness or richness of some of those kind of lager-like strains? And what can a kind of brewer might use as a workaround to get that nice crispness instead of the full body kind of experience you get?
Ah, okay. So sort of on that topic of pseudo loggers with Kvike, and I do encourage you to try out Crispy, even put it head to head with Oslo and see what you think.
Challenge accepted.
Um, that's always fascinating. Yeah, so I mean, and I think what we can talk about with this is maybe some of the adjustments that need to be made if you're trying to make something that tastes like a lager but is fermented with a Kvike, because they're different. They're totally different yeast, right? Lager yeast, I mean, I think we have this in our mind that lager yeast is just characterless and has no flavor, but it actually does do a lot of things. It does have a distinct flavor, so we can't we can't ignore that. And so does Kvike, and it has its own behavior. And one of the things we've seen with creating lager-like beers with Kvike is that a lot of the Kvikes, for example, they're not always as attenuative as some of the lager yeast, especially the really common lager yeast that are used, like the 3470 strain is very, very attenuative, so it always makes something very dry and crisp, where Kvikes tend to be more like an English ale in terms of attenuation. So sometimes there can be adjustments made in the fermentability of the wort that can help to get those kind of lager like results if you're looking for something a little bit drier and crisper. And then another thing to think about is also, and this is something we've talked about a little bit, is different yeasts reduce the IBUs of the beer more than others. A lot of it has to do just with flocculation, right? These are the IBUs are compounds that can those alpha acids can stick to the yeast cell and get pulled out of solution. So lager yeast tend to not touch the bitterness very much, so they tend to accentuate hop bitterness, whereas some yeasts, including Kvikes, and especially yeast like English ale yeast, can really pull out that hop bitterness. So it can also mean that if you ferment the same wort with Kvike and lager yeast and they finish at the same gravity, the Kvike beer is probably still going to taste sweeter because it's actually pulled out some of the IBUs, some of those alpha acids. So it can help to bump up some of the bittering. Usually, sort of aim for clean bittering, doing a pseudo lager with Kvike. Maybe not that like 100% SOTS Czech pills. It's probably not going to work that well if you use Kvike, but if you do something more like a clean bittering and then whatever aroma hops you want to use, it can work pretty well. And that's what we've found, is just bumping up the hopping rate a little bit and making sure to make a pretty fermentable wort works quite well for the pseudo lagers with Kvike.
That's awesome. Good stuff. So following up to some more Kavaiki's questions. So what I remember, Chris Perricone, another scientist in the group here, he asks, why are Kavaikis able to ferment clean at such high temperatures? Has anyone done, I'm not a scientist, either genomic analysis to see how they differ from other strains?
I'm really hoping we can publish the answer to that sooner than later. And I will say that we do have some good ideas, better ideas about that. Than we've been able to share thus far. Unfortunately, on the academic side, right, their currency is publishing papers, so they can't just start sharing the data right away. But I can say that we have a better answer. We did sort of come up with some ideas when we did our first Kvike study that we published in 2018. We found some interesting genetic mutations in Kvike that were totally unique to Kvike that no other brewing yeast had. So we thought, okay, these are probably important to Kvike, being so special, being able to ferment and tolerate high temperatures and not get stressed out. So there were some genes that were related to things like alcohol tolerance and just general stress tolerance that had unique mutations that don't exist in any yeast except for Kvike. What I will say is that there's several that we missed completely in that study, and those are what actually might be more important in Kvike's ability to tolerate stress. And I'm really hoping that we can share some more details about that. But basically, Kvike are able to produce more of a compound that helps them to resist stress and sort of survive a wide range of different stressful environments. And that's probably why they stay clean even at high temperatures.
Interesting. So kind of thinking about some of those different aspects of the conditions that it can tolerate, a lot of people can kind of get a takeaway that Kvike yeast are a little bit more pH tolerant than specific strains. So Fred also had reached out to say, you heard that you guys were looking into that, more so what was the outcome? How did it compare to some of the other yeasts that are typically used in those lower pH fermentation environments, whether it be beer, cider, wine, and whether this would be a probable application for kettle sours or, for a component for repitching?
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, different yeasts are more pH tolerant than others, and certain yeasts are more tolerant to certain acids than others. Like lactic acid stress is different from acetic acid stress, for example. So depending on the beer it's going into, the yeast might respond differently. In general, Kvike are quite resistant. They're quite tolerant to low pH, high acid environments. Very, very similar to wine yeast, cider yeast, saison yeast, things like that tend to be very, very good at tolerating those environments. Whereas a lot of the more domesticated beer yeasts, English, American, German, Kolsch yeast, things like that, tend to not tolerate the low pH quite as well. It doesn't mean that they won't ferment out a kettle sour. It just means that they might be a little bit slower to adapt.
Very cool.
And then by that virtue, because they tolerate the lower pH better, they can be repitched. Like we have a few commercial clients who, they've picked Kvike for their kettle sours or quick sours, and they're repitching it for that.
Interesting. All right, so we also had a question from Larry Bentley, member of Garden State Homebrewers, 2020 New Jersey Homebrewer of the Year. Said, can you comment on best practices for inoculation rate, temperature, and time for a starter on a stir plate? Would it be recommended that time is tied to the inoculation rate, volume, or potential for damage to the yeast by spinning too long? I guess how long is too long, right? And in his specific case, they're spun at 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Don't know the conversion. They don't teach us that here. And cold crash for 1 to 2 days before pitching.
I've had to learn the conversions. I've had to internalize them, and hopefully someone's checking my work. But I'm usually pretty close. Okay, yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it's something that I think we've been trying to answer for 6 years, in the sense that all we do is grow yeast, and we're still learning. To be honest, we're still learning, how to improve that process. But based on what we've learned so far, I would say, my general advice, especially at the homebrew scale, is just keep it simple. In general, inoculation rate doesn't, maybe this is a controversial thing to say, in general, inoculation rate doesn't matter that much. I know that the calculators tell you it does, but our practical experience says it really doesn't matter. In general, I wouldn't pitch too much into a starter because you want the yeast to grow. You don't want a bunch of older cells in there. They always, any yeast culture will hit basically a certain cell density and stop growing. So you don't want it to be too close to that in the initial pitch. So I would say if you're building a starter, try not to pitch too much yeast. Like I would say, if it's a good size homebrew pouch like ours or Omega, Imperial, companies like that, I would say I would probably pitch one of the pouches into a 2-liter starter, for example, and take it from there, or half the pouch into a 1-liter starter. And that should grow pretty well. A 2-liter starter would be more than enough for pretty much any 5-gallon batch, for example. It might be enough for a 2 or 3 batches, depending on the strain. In terms of time, again, my suggestion is just keep it simple. For flocculent yeasts, let it spin until you start seeing it clump up, and then you can take it off and let it sort of chew through the rest. The yeast won't start really flocculating until it's chewed through some of the sugars. So it kind of gives you this visual cue. For most other yeast, I would say stir it, as long as it's fresh, stir it for a day or two. If it's near its expiry date, maybe 2 or 3 days is the right way to go. And the nice thing with like homebrew propagation is you can see inside the flask. You can see whether it's getting thicker. You can see whether it's flocculating. You have all of these sort of visual signals. I think the temperature is fine. That'll work for any strain. 70 Fahrenheit, like room temperature, is fine. And I think cold crashing is a good idea if you've got the time to do it. I don't think it's necessary, but I think it is helpful. It is definitely helpful also, being able to crash out that propagation liquid. Always, is not the best beer. Having tasted ours, it's not something you really want to drink. So it can help to crash that out. It's not necessary, especially if the starter isn't like a huge volume. But what cold crashing does is it does actually help the cells, the yeast, to make some useful things for the future fermentation. So when it's exposed to the cold, it'll accumulate things like glycogen and trehalose that are these storage compounds that actually help the yeast to start growing and start fermenting later on when it's pitched into the wort. So that cold crashing can also help with the yeast in terms of its health, in addition to also, helping to crash it out and not pitch as much of the starter beer into the fermentation.
That's a great little tidbit. I'm gonna have to remember that, because I usually crash them for a couple hours and then pour off as much as I can and hit the races.
Yeah. It depends on the strain. Like if it's an English strain, then you don't even need to crash it. You just let it sit for an hour, and it's you can decant the whole thing.
Yeah.
So
very awesome. So Tom Dimitrowski in the club, Garden State Homebrewers as well. So we actually had a barrel project that there was quite a few members in the club took part in. First, we ran through it. I will say they, because I did not take part in it, but they filled it with a sizer, hit it with wine yeast, let that go out. It's an old oak apple brandy barrel, recently emptied, filled with a triple. Now, Tom's question is that recently it was tasted at about 4+ months, soured slightly. Drop in pH was from 4.3 to 4.0. His question specifically is that sadly the triple yeast characteristic, the esters and the phenols, are pretty much gone. So they've got a nice, smooth, slightly sour yellow base beer. So his 2-part question is it possible the wine yeast took over and metabolized the Belgian phenols and ester profile? Might there potentially be acetobacter and or lactic acid that's just masking it? And the second part, they're probably going to roll with souring the barrel. I've already recommended for them to just go towards the sun, pitch Brett and some other lab and see what happens. But kind of looking for your take on what could have happened and what's the best progression for the barrel.
how big is the barrel? Like a standard wine barrel size?
Tom, some of these guys, what is that? That's like a
standard.
like 53, 55
Yeah,
gallons.
50 something gallons. Yeah, about
Yeah,
50,
about 50.
55.
Okay, and I wonder if maybe there is something that carried over from the sizer, or I guess probably from the sizer, that might have impacted it. Like whether it's the wine yeast or whether it's maybe some other wild yeast or bacteria that could have been in there. The reality with barrels is they're almost never aseptic. There's always something that can grow in them, right? Wood is notoriously hard to sterilize, so it could just be something that was in there from the previous ferment, whether it's the wine yeast or not, that might have done something with the flavors of that Belgian yeast for the triple. So I kind of agree with that idea. It could just be something from the previous ferment taking over. pH dropping, you very well could have some bacteria in there, lactic acid bacteria that are dropping that pH, especially if it wasn't, super high IBU beer. That very well could be what would happen. If you're finding that it's not very exciting right now, it's 4 pH, and you haven't really got much of the primary yeast character left, then I would say pitch some other stuff in there. If you pitch some Brett in there, then you're going to pick up, at least get the Brett flavors in there, and give it a lot more character. So that might be the way to go at this point. Seeing that reduction in the primary yeast character and that kind of continuous pH reduction suggests to me that it might already be a little bit a little bit wild.
On its way there. Do you think there's any correlation between those like phenols and esters being suppressed and that drop in pH?
I mean there can be, I guess. Like it signals to me that there's probably something else growing in there, and at the end of the day, those phenols and esters can be used by other microbes for whatever the heck they're trying to do at the time. So, or you are correct. Especially in terms of like flavor perception, sometimes that can mask it a little bit.
Interesting. So one question that I definitely had is I've been running a couple smaller barrels in the basement, just kind of doing spontaneously cooled wort, but each inoculation is just like a battle royale of 20, 30 dregs of all different sorts of lambics and sour beers, as well as some lab pitches. I've primarily taken the approach of performing all the primary fermentation in the barrel, right? Just to really kind of get some of those other characteristics that come out of it. My oldest barrels are kind of reaching that 3rd-year mark where I'm starting to be concerned about how much lees and sediment we might actually have in the barrel. In terms of how I'm using it, it's kind of in the full era style, about 8 to 10 months typically in terms of it being full, pull about 10, 15 gallons, fill it back up, rinse, repeat. Do you think at that level, 3 years worth of maybe that's what, 3, 4 fills, sediment or kind of the lees that are remaining might be detrimental and no longer providing food for Brett or some of the other organisms there, that I might be kind of past a point of just dump it, empty it completely, and then, refill and just let it ride?
Yeah, I mean, over time, and this is true, not even in barrels, but even in just like repitching yeast, over time, if it's repitched, with too much slurry, you can sometimes have some suppression of flavor or some off flavors over time. I have seen it with mixed cultures and sour beers in barrels where, after 4 or 5 fills, you can start to get some of those really, like, you get the autolysis flavors, like that kind of, it's like dead yeast, right? Rubbery, kind of toasty characteristics that, if there's too much of it, it can be pretty distracting. So, my approach for something like that that's kind of managed as a Solera is, dump slurry every 4 fills. And that's worked pretty well for me. Just having seen it sort of go off the rails on the other side. But yeah, having some in there is actually, like, some of the lees, some of the, those mixed firm contexts, having some dead yeast in there is helpful because it does kind of provide nutrients and building blocks and flavor precursors for the yeasts that are in there having a party.
For sure. So not yet cause for alarm, but keep an eye on it.
Yeah. You'll know when you go to rack out of it and, like, the bottom 4 inches are just yeast, you'll know that you've got too much in there.
Yeah, for sure. Tough to keep an eye on it. So Jason asked a question in the chat. This I'm excited for the approach because I've heard you talk about some of these components about how co-pitching or delayed pitching may or may not play such a role in some of the characteristics, but do you have any recommendations specifically regarding mixed fermentation sour beers, co-pitching lacto and Brett, Saccharomyces and Brett, or delaying Brett and pitching to promote those Brett aromatics after the fact?
Yeah, and this is a case where the lab data has been pretty unclear in the sense that at least if you look at Sac Brett combinations, it doesn't seem like it matters too much whether they're pitched together, whether the the Brett is pitched in secondary, you tend to get pretty similar outcomes. When you get lacto in the mix, like, things can get a little bit more complex and a little bit more challenging. In general, like, my approach is for a lot of things is to keep it simple. If I'm doing a mixed ferm sour, I'll probably just pitch everything at once. That being said, it kind of depends on the fermentation environment. I know for a lot of breweries, they don't want to do that because they don't want to contaminate the stainless steel tank that they're doing primary in. Likewise, for home brewing, with if you are doing a primary ferment and then racking something to a barrel or a secondary for long-term funking and souring. Although, like, it is a bit of a balancing act. Like, for example, if you get a really aggressive lacto and it sours the beer too fast, then you kind of lose that potential for the Brett aroma, because the Brett aromatics don't really come out so much in a very acidic beer. So it is a balancing act. What I have done for a few different beers is, just for that reason, is I don't really have any issues with when Sack and Brett are pitched, but lacto, I really don't want it souring before, or PDO, I don't want them souring before the Brett's done anything. So my typical approach is either pitch Sack or Sack and Brett first. Let it get down to a good final gravity, and get some of the Brett aromatics coming out, and then maybe pitch another mixed culture that contains lacto and PDO. Maybe it also contains some Brett as well, but that's worked pretty well for kind of getting that balanced flavor profile.
Do you think pitching the lacto or PDO kind of that late in the game takes away from some of the kind of the potential drop in pH? Might you see kind of a different acidification based on the timeline of when it's added, aside from the time it takes to produce the lactic acid, but I guess for the potential lactic acid produced?
I'm not sure. In general, they don't require a whole lot. And, the nice thing is that as the primary yeast is dying off, they'll release a lot of the stuff that lacto really loves growing on. Like, when we grow lacto cultures in the lab, the main component of the media is yeast extract. It's dead yeast. They love growing on it. So that is something that can help sort of sustain, lacto, PDO, lactic acid bacteria, even if there's not much sugar left.
Very cool. So after watching one of your recent crowdcasts, I'm going to actually be brewing on Monday, and I'm going to be employing your kind of reverse pitching approach in terms of Brett followed by some Sack to clean up. For some of the guys that maybe aren't familiar with it, would you mind kind of going through what you saw with this and what the experience was, and kind of the approach to this kind of, I guess, not really unheard of approach to it, but just definitely kind of against conventional norms, as we know, most recently.
Yeah. So that's sort of the idea of how do we make a Brett ferment easier, because Brett really isn't very good at primary fermentation in the way that Sack is, right? It's slow. It really doesn't like being in a totally oxygen deprived environment. So, but the advantage of Brett on its own, Brett primary, is that it's super flavorful. So, that's an idea that we're still exploring, is having a fermentation where Brett is pitched first, given a head start, but then you can pitch a reliable Saccharomyces to kind of clean it up and finish out the ferment. And it does seem to work pretty well. More recently, we've been settling more on just having a blend up front, like having a higher pitch rate of Brett, a smaller pitch rate of Sack. And, that's kind of where we've been at right now for testing that. And we're hoping to have a product kind of based on that idea, but it does work pretty well. And, I really, appreciate that you can get a ferment that's done in 10 or 11 days versus like a month or a month and a half that some of the Brett primaries take.
That's awesome. Well, if you need some beta testers, let me know.
All right. We'll keep that in mind.
Cool stuff. What are you sipping on, by the way?
I've got a Dortmunder from
nice.
a brewery just down the road here called Allura Brewing. So they make a lot of lagers and a lot of just sort of standard craft beer offerings, hazy IPA, sours, and stuff like that. But nice sort of little brewery. They've got like a brew pub set up. kind of a tourist town. So try to support them whenever possible.
Nice. Do they use your yeast?
They do, yeah. They have for a very long time, I think 5 years now.
Cool. Very awesome. So what else kind of you've been working on or kind of taking a look at in more of the research realm that you are able to share with us? Any kind of new kind of different approaches or kind of less than conventional approaches or things you're looking into that maybe, I know you guys have kind of had a tendency to start looking at some of those kind of weird things that were, well, maybe this deserves a second look, right? Let's not accept it just for the anecdotal evidence that is pretty rampant in the homebrew community. Kind of what, I guess, weird stuff or interesting or wayward type things are you guys taking an approach on or looking into in
Oh,
the realm of yeast?
lots of weird stuff. I've been joking with our team that 2021 is the year that we do 2017 right, because a lot of the stuff that we're thinking about and focusing on is not ideas that are new to us. It's just that we have the resources to do it right this time. And go back to some of these things like we're sort of seeing, for example, Brett and mixed firm beers. After kind of taking a clawbring to kettle sours, we kind of see those coming back. So we're excited about the possibilities of some new products in that space. So that's one of maybe one of the weirder things that we're working on is how can we produce and release a full mixed culture that's never really been isolated, because we've seen enough evidence that when you try to compose these things, it doesn't work as well as if you just start with a great mixed culture. So, I guess that's one sort of crazy thing is, how does a yeast company that's focused on pure yeast cultures go and make something that's, never been actually isolated and picked apart and make sure that it's safe and consistent?
Yeah, I guess the
So
consistency is a tough part there, right? How do you control something from just going, full steam and or suppressing some of the others?
exactly. So I mean, we've got some modern tools that are going to help us there. We're definitely taking a lot, much more careful look at wild yeast again. That's something that we didn't really focus on for a few years, but we had a really good, really lucky 2020 wild yeast harvest season, and we found some things that we think are going to be great for non-alcoholic beers. We found a couple of these sour yeasts that are becoming popular. We found a couple of cold tolerant yeasts, so a lot of really cool stuff that I think that we can turn into products in the future.
Interesting. So have you guys looked into anything of more than kind of what's known in the realm of THP or some of the ropiness that Pediococcus can lend sometimes as part of the fermentation process? And I know anecdotally, these guys all know, big mixed firm drinker, lambic drinker. I've seen it in my beers, right? I've had beers go ropey and give it time and it ends up being okay. And usually you do get a more refined or at least a mature or more complex character out of it. But have you had any kind of distinctions or seen where the end product that comes out of these phases, are there correlations to say that it will be better or may not be better depending on kind of some of the levels of that ropiness or kind of what those off flavors are at least in that
Yeah,
point might be?
it's not something, to be honest, it's something we've looked at um, in the lab, on an analytical level. I think that would be interesting, to get a beer that goes ropey and try to measure what types of polysaccharides, because that's what it is. It's just sugars basically being polymerized together and making that kind of gel. Um, be interesting to measure and see what's in there, and then see how it breaks down and how long it takes, and whether there is some of that residual polysaccharide left in it. I imagine there is, and that's probably why you might see a beer that does go through that ropey phase like lambic does. Why you might see a long-term sort of benefit to the texture of the beer. I've seen it, in my own sour beer brewing, that the beers that do go through that do tend to have better body afterward.
Yeah, for sure. Is there any correlation to that with like some of the other lactic acid producing yeasts or any kind of variations to that? And I guess kind of an own personal follow-up for that is, it's been known that Brett can help with, consuming those polysaccharides or also consuming the THP to kind of make those problems go away. Have you found that specific strains of Brett are better at some of those cleanup efforts for some of these potential off flavors than some other either lab strains or Brett strains?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, Brett's a really, a fascinating microbe in the sense that it's so good at scavenging, little bits and pieces of things to survive, and that's what it's doing in those beers, right? It's going to break apart those polysaccharides so it can ferment a little bit of sugar. It's going to, maybe take a little bit of these flavors that other yeasts and bacteria have made and turn it into something else to get a little bit of energy out. It's just, so, and that includes things like THP. It's just so good at scavenging and getting energy from all of these random molecules. In general, I would say that the more aggressive Brett strains are the Brett bruxellensis, like any member of that species, and that's most of the Brett strains that are available commercially. I would say that, and I don't know, this is sort of anecdotal, but what I've found is that the Bretts that are pretty good at cleaning these things up are also the ones that are associated with lambic. So, Brett strains that are isolated from lambic seem to be pretty good at cleaning up things like the EPS and like the PDO ropiness. Seem to be pretty good at cleaning up THP that you might get in a sour beer. But I mean, I don't have any hard data on that. We haven't been able to measure like EPS or THP, for example.
The consumer of all things literally eats everything. Love it. Cool. So yeah, guys, anyone want to kind of jump in? Any other questions you guys are mulling over, thinking about? Feel free to unmute and
Matt from Garden State Homebrewers and many other places. Too many to describe. Beers also. Can we go back into pitching rates? And you mentioned something very distinct about pitching rates don't really matter. I work at I mean, you didn't necessarily say that, but I am I guess now technically production manager at a brewery, and I keep a tight rope on yeast and how much we're pitching, mainly because it's a product of our bottom line. But also, I find that we all know we hear about the over pitching doesn't put any character in your beer, blah blah blah. Now, from a home brewing standpoint, we were always taught that like 0.75 million cells per milliliter per Plato was like what you should shoot for. Now, on average here, if you could put it into that statement, even though that would be a crazy way to do the math on it, but we're about 0.3, and 0.3, our yeast is firing within 6 hours, maybe 12. I mean, probably 12 nowadays. But do you have any comment on or any insight on the idea behind pitch rates and why they do and or do not matter, and if it's yeast based or strain based?
For sure, yeah. And my comment was specifically with respect to Kvike, where it really doesn't, at least based on the data, it doesn't seem like it mattered too much for some of the strains, but for others it does, and that's true of any other yeast as well. I would say that some yeasts are more tolerant of a wider range of pitching rates than others. Some of the strains really it doesn't make a big difference, but for others you can kind of pinpoint the differences between pitch rates. In general, I think the original or the general recommendations for pitching rates does kind of come from lager brewing, where you're pitching a lot of yeast because it's a cold ferment, and you need to throw a lot of biomass at it so that it gets going and gets fermenting, and then a lot of the pitching rate recommendations kind of just walk back from there, right? Like I think that's probably how 0.75 was landed at, because it's half of the recommended lager pitching rate. It doesn't mean that it's the right one. It doesn't mean that it's the right one for every single yeast. I do like a lower pitching rate for certain yeasts, like Belgian yeast and Saison yeast and Kveik, things like that, that I think really tolerate the lower pitching rate and that are more expressive with lower pitching rates. But there are other yeasts where they really benefit from a higher pitching rate. Like I would say, for example, a yeast like a Kolsch yeast really, struggles at whether it's under or over pitched, that they tend to misbehave, for example. So it does depend on the strain. I would say, like, especially, I'm not sure if you're propagating in-house or if you're, or if you're buying the culture, but I would say, especially with a fresh culture, that your pitch rate is not crazy low. It does depend on the strain that you're using.
So I mean, we're getting out of, we're a 5-barrel brew house. Our typical batch is 10 barrels, but we're usually starting with about 3 liters in one, and then we play old musical chairs, and we have certain beers that we prop it in, and then so we're getting up to about 6 or 7 generations with one pitch over 150 barrels. But I mean, like when we're pulling it, we pull it warm and then we crash it, and then we're pitching. That lot that we take usually is pitched over 1 week, and so it's usually pretty fresh. It doesn't even have time to realize that it's doom. But yeah, so we were also, our oxygen rate is a little bit higher because we know that we're pushing its boundaries. This is all we don't have any science behind it. There is science behind it because it's practice and we're taking note of the things that we've done and how they've affected it, which is technically science. I guess my point is like when I was homebrewing, I was making starters and things like that and trying to hit those numbers. And there's some people who will call me out on me saying that, like London Ale 3 should be pitched at 0.9. I don't know if I still believe that. Because we use Burlington, or White Labs Burlington, which is basically along the lines of that. And also a great yeast. I shouldn't say this, but we make West Coast with it because as long as you are manipulating it in a way where it can do the things where we don't want it to be fruity, so we'll ferment at a certain temperature. We'll also pitch a higher rate, so it's not creating those esters. So I guess back to my original thing, like pitch rate matters? ?
It's such a complicated thing, right? Because it depends on the strain, it depends on the condition of the yeast, it depends on, like you said, the oxygen, right? You can compensate for a lower pitch rate with a higher oxygen rate. So it's really hard to have like a universal truth with this stuff. It really does come down to like, okay, let's try something and then make some adjustments up or down from there.
Yeah. Cool.
You find certain strains or types of yeast are either helped more or less by the addition of oxygen?
Yes, for sure.
Or you think it's kind of like a standard, just de facto always adopt this more so?
No, some need more than others. So like the yeast, especially the yeast that are, I would say there's a few yeasts that really, really benefit from a lot of oxygen. And that's the yeast that you kind of associate with, where the traditional context is open fermentation. So English yeast, especially the ones that are used for hazy IPAs, really benefit from a lot of oxygen up front. Yep. Same is true for Weizen yeasts. Same is true for a lot of the Belgian strains. Whereas the American ale strains, like Cali, Chico, doesn't really care. You can give it like very little oxygen, and it'll still somehow figure out how to crush through the wort. And likewise, like lager yeast don't have a super, at least in our experience, they're not super picky. They need oxygen, but they don't, freak out quite as much if they don't get enough as compared to something like a Foggy London Ale 3 kind of strain.
Is there a potential for doing damage with too much oxygen for a lager yeast?
No, I wouldn't think so. Like one of the nice things about yeast is that they're really, really good at taking up the oxygen that you put in. So, as long as the yeast culture is healthy, that's been pitched, it should take up that dissolved oxygen, and there shouldn't be any damage to the cells, or the beer, right? You shouldn't have any oxidation of the beer itself, and there shouldn't be any issues with over oxygenating the yeast. As long as it has sugar available and it's, growing, it's going to use that oxygen for the power of good.
Okay. Thank you.
So kind of talking about some of the things that might stress out yeast. What are your thoughts on pressurized fermentations? Do you think they have specific applications? Are there times where you might want to use it? Maybe you should stray away from that.
It's not a huge stressor for the yeast until you get to the really, really big tanks, like until you get to macro brew 500 barrel tanks. That's where it becomes, more of an issue. But, one of the benefits of yeast cells is that they're tiny spheres, and it just so happens that tiny spheres are, even from a physics perspective, really, really good at resisting pressure, especially hydrostatic pressure. So yeast cells can handle pressure very, very well. You can pressurize them to champagne levels, which is way higher than any beer would go, and they're still going to be pretty viable and pretty happy. So they handle pressure very well. I wouldn't worry too much about that.
Does it affect or suppress or increase the presence of esters or the perceived presence of esters?
So yeah, pressure's been shown to reduce the production of esters. Basically sort of makes a fermentation behave more like a fermentation that's a few degrees colder, that's unpressurized.
Could you account for that by slightly dialing up your temperature if you're pressure fermenting?
Yeah, for sure. And that's very commonly employed in especially in macro brewing, where a lot of them are fermenting at 15 to 18 Celsius. So in the 60s, but with pressure, just because it results in a faster fermentation.
I mean, I definitely have noticed that, my standard for mixed fermentation beers, majority of what I will make is I don't even taste bottles really anymore before 2-3 months. I found that 3 months is, and I've always said, obviously all anecdotally, maybe you can back this up, that beautiful things happen under pressure with Brett. Anytime any of my mixed ferment beers occur, that's where that Brett expression really takes hold. Have you found kind of maybe a line in the sand or a litmus test of what do you think the proper time to bottle condition mixed fermentation beers or beers with Brett specifically, in terms of how much can you expect for that expression from that secondary or even sometimes tertiary fermentation at that point, to really come through and be at that level that it's okay, here's what you're going to get from this process?
I think the best example of this is Orval, right? One of the classic Brett beers is, you can taste that beer, and you can sometimes get it when it's only 2 or 3 months old, and taste it, and then taste it. If you get enough bottles, you can taste it every few months and really get a sense of what the Brett is doing. And I think that's pretty interesting. And I would say, at least from my perspective, 2 or 3 month old Orval kind of sucks. It's not very good. It's really estery, a lot of red apple esters, and it's only once the Brett starts to take hold, maybe 4+ months, and a year in is probably when it's at its prime. You get a sense of what the Brett can do, and I think it always does take some time. It does depend on the Brett strain, it does depend on the beer, but I really like any beers with Brett. Typically you're not at the point where they've really fully expressed themselves until you're about 6 months in. We do have some data on that, where 1 to 3 months in, you tend to sort of be halfway there, and then 6 months in, you get kind of the full expression of the Brett, and then over time beyond that, it's just things are changing, things are not necessarily increasing.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, definitely when I can wait 6 months to pop one of those bottles of mine, it definitely night and day experience, from where it came from. And kind of on like the Brett aspect too, or the Orval aspect, I also don't particularly love fresh Orval, and I love that beer, but for me, like 2 to 3 year Orval is like, that's my sweet spot. If I see it in a store, I always grab it standard, and I sock it away, just waiting for it to kind of hit its stride. But definitely a different expression at at that point for sure. So Bob Orger in the group commented that okay, so English ale wants oxygen because it has traditionally been brewed in an open fermenter. I've actually done a couple open ferments, kind of quasi open ferments, usually for like 4 or 5 days before bunging it. And definitely did see a much more different expression in what was coming through. But I guess
Dan, my comment was seriously, is more about the fact that this talk's all about evolution right here. You got a bunch of Nordic farmers who can't chill their wort, so they put it at high temperatures, and the yeast that works gets selected for being able to work at high temperatures. And English ale gets pitched in open fermenters and is exposed to lots of oxygen, so it works really well in oxygen. So it's all about this unintentional artificial selection.
Yeah, it's battle hardened.
You got it. That is exactly what we're seeing is all these artifacts of evolution of the yeast and selection by humans, right? And there's a lot we can learn from the yeast by going into their history.
Definitely.
I got a question.
Sure.
So I've only really heard of the practice of hitting a beer with oxygen twice if it's like a high gravity beer. So if it was a hazy beer that you were, using an English strain, would that benefit from like a 24-hour post-pitch second dose of oxygen? Would that be the same concept?
I probably wouldn't, just because if it's not a high grav beer, it doesn't really need that much. Like it should get a good dose of pure oxygen at the start. And although that being said, like if you were to add more a day in, there wouldn't be that much risk in terms of oxidation because you'll have lots of yeast in there that'll happily take it up. I'm just not sure if there would be much benefit to it unless it's like a really, really challenging high gravity ferment.
Can I argue that not on the yeast side, but on the hop side, if you biohop and also add oxygen at the same time, you are releasing different compounds from those hops, and then they would be reabsorbed by the yeast. But then also the yeast would absorb some of those compounds by the hops. So
yeah, it can get complicated when you get hops in the mix because you're right. Like some things can taste better or worse in the hops if they're oxidized, right? So yeah, it ggets complicated.
So kind of on that, but right before you had joined, we were kind of just chatting amongst ourselves and talking a little bit about kind of the whole concept of hop creep. And people are kind of chiming in, yeah, I've seen it. Some others haven't seen it. Have you noticed if there's any certain strains that either may perpetuate hop creep to be more present than others? Is there a correlation to kind of anything in terms of, this creep that has kind of become much more
in terms of hop strains?
Or in terms of yeast strains? Like, are there any yeast strains have you seen that might either be more or less susceptible to this, concept of hop creep?
Okay, on the yeast end, not really, just because it's if you're talking hop creep, what you're talking is that there's enzymes in the hops that are glucoamylase enzymes that'll break down some of the sugar, some of the residual sugar, like the starches and dextrins in the beer, and so kind of cause a secondary fermentation when dry hops are added. In terms of yeast strain, I mean, I guess for like a slower yeast, it's going to be more of an issue because they're just going to struggle harder with, fermenting through that hop creep. And I know that it is an issue for some yeast that are prone to diacetyl because you might have a yeast ferment that goes through, it's clean, it gets clears diacetyl test, and then the beer's dry hopped, and then all of a sudden there's a bunch of diacetyl because of that second ferment that has to be cleaned up. And then it's always a battle of time between preserving the hop aromas and getting rid of that diacetyl. So really kind of a pain there. So I would say like it does, but it does come down to, the upfront health of that yeast. Any yeast can get through it if it's happy. I would say there are some that are, easier than others. Like, Kvike is pretty well known for not producing diacetyl, so that could be a good option for those kinds of situations. If you find yourself using hops that happen to have a lot of potential for hop creep, a lot of diastatic power, and I know it's semi-random, which is part of the frustration, right? Like the reducing kilning temperatures of the hops has caused this problem because brewers want more aroma. And we sort of kind of found ourselves in this position, although it does seem to be linked to certain varieties in certain years. Like I know there was like a couple years of Mosaic that was really bad for it, for example. So I know the hop scientists know a lot more about that than I do. But yeah, in terms of the yeast, I would say, some of them just struggle more than others at getting through that secondary ferment. So some might be better suited or worse suited.
Secondary or follow-up question to that. Let's say that you dry hopped and then capped your dry hop, and then the final of that was done under pressure. Does a yeast produce less diacetyl under pressure?
Less diacetyl. I don't know if there would be. I don't know if that's been studied, to be honest. I would think that would be independent of temperature, but I'm not sure.
Okay. Only
I would
reason
put in, sorry, Matt, I would put in, because I know we were talking earlier about your yeast strain there, but I would put in that if you have a very flocculent yeast and you're dry hopping pretty late, right, you're going to wind up with less of an effect, right, because you got a much lower yeast concentration when you're dry hopping.
Mm-hmm. It can be, yeah, that is correct. That being said, the worst thing you want to do is send a beer that has active amylase enzyme. I mean, on a homebrew scale, it's probably fine. For the pro breweries, if they send a beer that has active amylase enzyme into cans and there's even a little bit of yeast left in there, then they get re-fermentation and exploding cans and stuff like that. And I know that's I know exploding cans are all the rage this day, but it's probably something to be avoided.
masculine fruit puree.
Just partially fermented pie filling.
Yeah,
that's what I like to call it.
Yeah, just make beer with lactose. Done.
Yeah, that's it. Equals money. Cool. So, gentlemen, we're coming up on time a little bit. So if you guys got any other kind of final remarks, final questions, this is your last call. Let's get it out there. Definitely feel free to jump in.
Loggers are life, right?
Well, yes. So if you don't know this, I mean, I know Richard as the granddaddy of Whip the Meringue. This is where I was introduced to it, and have since exposed others in the group to it.
Hell yeah, yeah! Whip the Meringue, one of I guess a side project. I love it because there's so many just negative spaces in social media, and I love that Whip the Meringue is this very positive space for people just to post beautiful beers
of foam positivity.
Exactly. That's a lot of fun.
Oh, yeah, that actually brings up a great question about foam and yeast impact on it.
Oh yes, my mind's going places now too.
Any general knowledge on that thought of what yeast can give and take away from foam positivity?
Yeah, the yeast giveth and the yeast taketh. Some of them do actually have unique proteins that help with foam. So lager yeast has a special gene, a special protein that actually helps promote foam. So that might be why you see, a lot of lager beers have awesome foam, and part of that is the influence of the yeast. Other yeasts, like non-hybrid, regular old Cerevisiae yeast, do have it too. Sake yeast has it, and that was actually a huge problem because as soon as the sake breeding institute was able to take that trait out of the yeast, all of a sudden the sake brewers could fill their fermenters full versus 50%. So they got a massive efficiency boost from some yeast engineering. So it's a thing in some other yeasts as well. And then on the other hand, there are some yeasts that, especially if they're like unhappy, they will release proteases, and they'll actually break down proteins. And if you have too much protein breakdown, then you can also have degradation of the foam. So some of those yeasts that are really hungry for nitrogen, if they're not getting enough of it, they might break down the foam and, or break down the proteins in the beer. And, this is a root cause of one of the root causes of bad foam. It's also one of the root causes of, what you see sometimes in hazy IPAs that suddenly turn clear or chunky is essentially the yeast, stressing out, releasing some proteases, and in some, not in all cases, they'll sometimes start to break down that haze, because that haze is like a protein polyphenol haze. So, that's a pretty big deal in the hazy IPA world.
That's actually a very great point. We had a beer here that, we hit all our marks, and we thought it was oxidized, because that's another thing that can possibly happen with a hazy beer, is if you get a small ingestion or ingress of oxygen, it can actually clear out the beer, because it may reinvigorate the yeast and things like that, and cause that problem because the yeast is stressed.
Yep. Yeah, and that's why you often see it after packaging.
Yeah.
So Richard, what's your go-to if you had to say you have a house yeast for a home? I'm not sure how much you still homebrew. I hope you still do. What's your go-to in terms of you're brewing a beer, throwing the kitchen sink at it? What are you fermenting with?
I homebrew, but at work.
So you're basically a pro brewer because then you get paid for it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
No, you got to sell it. You got to sell it in order for it to be a pro brewery.
Yeah, I've really been enjoying brewing with a new yeast that we bred called Jotun. So it's a hybrid of Kvike and Saison yeast. It has some of the traits of both. Like it'll ferment a beer to total dryness like a Saison yeast, but it has some of the nice fruitiness and some of the flocculation of a Kvike. So it's been really fun to play with something that's totally new and figure out what it can do. So that's what I've been brewing with a lot lately, is just trying to make some basically delicious clean saisons, and that's something that I haven't really put a lot of energy into, and kind of learning on that front. How do I make a saison that's not loaded full of Brett and lacto and make it delicious? So that's been a lot of fun.
Oh, you're talking to me. Is that commercially available already, or no? It's still in the pipeline. Yep. Oh, nice.
It's still available. It's available. Yeah, you can get it through Sonata or anywhere else.
Oh, I'll have to pick that up. I didn't realize that was a Kvike Saison blend.
Mm-hmm.
Very cool.
Hybrid.
Very cool.
Yeah, and then beyond that, I love our Beer Garden Lager is an awesome strain too.
Have you played around with any of your yeast in the bread making?
Yes. Yes. I did some focaccia on the weekend with Laerdal Kvike, and in general, the Kvikes work pretty well for bread baking.
Ah, interesting. I actually have. That's one of the pouches I won at the competition. I mean, what's funny is that I won the Laerdal and the Epigarden. The Epigarden package is inflated and it's big. And every time I open the fridge, I'm like, shit, I should probably use that one next.
Yeah, some of them, if they get old, they start breaking, basically eating themselves, and you get some of the bloating.
Very cool. All right, boys, this is your last call. If somebody's got something else to ask the man.
I just want to say thanks for spending more. This was super cool. Way better than us just cracking on each other and shooting shit about what's going on with our batch.
I mean, we're still gonna do that, right?
Yeah, well, of course. Yeah. No, but seriously, Richard, thanks so much for taking the time and being receptive to joining us. This has been absolutely fantastic. It's been such a breath of fresh air to start to have some guests join us. This is only the second month. Last month, we actually had Tim from Outbro join us. I tried to get him to join here tonight, but he had some other stuff going on. But he talked malt. It was great. Just to try to break up, the monotony of, I mean, don't get me wrong. I love seeing these guys on video and drinking and bullshitting, but we miss the nerdy aspects of it. So thank you so much for filling the void of, some of the more nerdy aspects and knowledge transfers that we've definitely been missing out for some of the in-person and sensory experience to the meetings we have.
Yeah, no, and it's cool to see you guys, kind of keep your community going. I think that's one of like the special things about home brewing is that it's so easy to kind of form these groups and get better together.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I'm going to send out some, especially for the guys that aren't a part of Garden State. I'll send up some resources, some of the work that Richard's done, some of the talks. Definitely take the deep dive. If you're at work, listen to podcasts or here and there. There's a lot of good information there. Yeah, man, definitely seek out their yeast. They're making some really cool stuff. Definitely gonna get my hands on the crispy. I'll let you know. Maybe I'll ship you a side by side of the Oslo and the crispy. Got to put them head to head and see what's up. But cool, man. Well, thanks so much again. I appreciate your time and appreciate you hearing us out, indulging in the nerdery. Best of luck. How you guys with the build out? You guys all wrapped up with the construction, or are you guys still undertaking it?
Phase 1 is done. Phase 2 is starting this year. So
very cool. Well, all the best, man. Definitely
Thank
stay
you.
safe, and thanks again.
Richard, thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
All right, thanks
Richard.
everyone. Nice to meet you.
You too, man.
Nice to
Be
meet
well.
you. Thank you, Richard.
Take care.